She wasn't loud. She wasn't unruly. She wasn't late. Mrs. Eloise Harper, 72 years old, wore a pressed lilac blouse, low-heeled shoes, and the quiet grace of a mother who raised a warrior. She boarded Flight 782 with nothing but a tote bag, a paperback novel, and the kind of poise that only comes from surviving decades of storms no one ever saw. But none of that mattered. Not when she was the only black woman in first class. Not when the flight attendant whispered into a walkie-talkie just moments after she sat down. Not when two uniformed security officers appeared to escort her off the plane for questioning. They told her it was a random security sweep, that her seat assignment was suspicious, that maybe she was using someone else's ticket. She showed them her boarding pass, her ID, even her frequent flyer status. It didn't matter. The other passengers watched in silence as she was walked back down the jet bridge, dignity intact, but heartbroken. She didn't argue. She'd learned long ago the price of dignity. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have known, was who her daughter was. At that very moment, Amara Harper, her daughter, was in a glass-walled boardroom overlooking the New York skyline, finishing the final paperwork on a $5 billion equity deal. CEO of Zenith Ventures, one of the largest black-owned investment firms in the world, Amara wasn't just a success story. She was a gatekeeper to the future of hundreds of corporations desperate for cash flow in a post-recession economy. And the airline that just dragged her mother off a plane, they were at the top of her firm's funding portfolio. It started with a single phone call. Her mother's trembling voice on the other end. Amara, they pulled me off the plane. They said I didn't belong in first class. The line went silent for a moment. Then Amara, composed but burning, replied, "Mom, I'll take care of it." The next morning, the airline CEO received an urgent email. Zenith Ventures was pulling out of all negotiations effective immediately. But that wasn't the worst part. Amara had already contacted four of the top black-owned venture firms and urged them to follow suit. Within 48 hours, the airline lost over $5 billion in projected funding. Their stock plummeted. What followed was a media frenzy. The company issued a lukewarm apology. "We regret any inconvenience caused to Mrs. Harper," but it was too late. Amara wasn't after money. She wanted a reckoning. She released a public statement. This wasn't about a seat on a plane. This was about how we continue to treat people who don't fit the mold. You judge my mother by her skin, not her humanity. You didn't see a passenger. You saw a profile. You saw a threat. And now you see the consequences. News outlets ran with it. The power of one mother. $5 billion lesson in respect. From jet bridge to justice. People cheered. People cried. Civil rights leaders hailed Amara's quiet storm as a blueprint for accountability in the corporate world. But beneath the headlines, there was something deeper, a question of how many mothers, fathers, and daughters never get their moment of justice. How many are silenced without a daughter at the top of a skyscraper boardroom? The airline tried damage control. They offered lifetime first-class tickets. A tearful CEO appeared on morning television, and they even invited Mrs. Harper to a private dinner. She declined, politely, powerfully, because the story wasn't over. 3 weeks later, an internal leak revealed something far more sinister. The random security check wasn't random at all. A private message chain among flight staff showed racial profiling had been standard protocol on certain routes. One message read, "Keep an eye on any suspicious boarding in premium seats." You know what I mean. The revelations shook the industry. Lawmakers began demanding hearings. Protesters gathered at airports nationwide. The FAA launched an investigation. But Amara, she was already working on something far bigger. She had quietly begun talks to launch Harper Air, a luxury, equity-backed airline designed to prioritize dignity, safety, and transparency. Her goal wasn't just revenge. It was revolution. In her next public speech, she looked directly into the cameras and said, "They thought my mother didn't belong. Now we're building a future where no one has to prove they do." The applause was thunderous. But just as the cameras cut away and anchors began to wrap the segment, an anonymous whistleblower dropped a bombshell. Mrs. Harper's name had been flagged not by airport security, but by an insider at the airline's corporate office. Someone knew who she was. Someone wanted to send a message. And now that message had sparked a firestorm. Who was behind it? Why target her? And how deep did this really go? The story of the mother they tried to erase was only just beginning, because this isn't just about one woman's seat on a plane. It's about who gets to fly and who gets grounded. It was supposed to end there. A public apology, a $5 billion loss, a drop in stock, and a lesson supposedly learned. The world had applauded Amara Harper's swift justice. The story trended for days. But beneath the applause, the wound still throbbed. Something didn't add up. The security team said it was a random flag. The airline blamed routine protocol. But the anonymous message that appeared in Amara's inbox late one night told a different story. Subject: urgent. She was targeted. Message: Mrs. Harper wasn't removed randomly. Someone high up made sure she'd be on that manifest. Flagged, watched, embarrassed. You're looking in the wrong place. It wasn't TSA. It was one of your own partners. Attached was a heavily redacted security memo dated 36 hours before the flight. One line was still visible. Flag Harper, Eloise, priority status override. Internal. That single sentence turned a public incident into a personal war. Amara had built her career on trust, on elevating underrepresented businesses, on partnerships forged in boardrooms where she was often the only black woman at the table. Now, she had to accept a harrowing truth. Someone she trusted helped humiliate her mother. She formed a small, silent investigation team. Lawyers, cybersecurity experts, and a trusted former federal agent who owed her a favor. They dug quietly, tracing emails, logging credentials, and private communications. And after weeks of silence, a name surfaced. Lawrence Crane, Chief Strategy Officer at Jetway Holdings. Ivy League charm, polished media persona, and one of Amara's earliest business allies. He was the one who pushed for Zenith Ventures to fund Jetway's expansion in the first place. He was also one of the few people who knew Eloise Harper often flew alone, quietly, between cities to visit children's hospitals as a volunteer. Why him? Why her? Then the next shoe dropped. Amara's head of compliance found encrypted files on an old shared drive, files that showed Jetway executives had conducted risk assessments on investors. Not just financial, but personal, family, habits, political affiliations. It was all there. And in Eloise's profile, soft target, high influence via Harper, watch activity. It wasn't racism alone. It was strategy. Jetway had been planning a restructuring that would shift control away from Zenith. By humiliating Amara's mother, they hoped to provoke a reaction, one that would make her appear emotional, volatile, unprofessional. They wanted her to pull the funding. They wanted her to walk away, so they could replace her stake with a private equity firm already lined up. But they miscalculated. Amara didn't burn down bridges. She exposed the architects. She scheduled an emergency shareholders call and streamed it live to the public. Calm, collected, but razor sharp, she presented the memo, the emails, the flag files. Not with rage, but with evidence. Names, titles, dates. When she dropped Lawrence Crane's name, the screen behind her lit up with his face. And then footage from a dinner where he was overheard saying, "She's powerful, sure, but everyone's got a soft spot. Hers is that sweet old lady. Watch." The silence was deafening. Within 24 hours, Crane was forced to resign. Jetway CEO stepped down. The Department of Transportation opened a federal inquiry into discriminatory investor profiling. The airline's board was dissolved and replaced under public pressure. But justice, Amara knew, was enough. Not when the same tactics would be used again on someone else's mother, sister, or daughter. She unveiled the final stage of her plan. The Harper Pledge, a national initiative demanding every airline, transportation company, and hospitality firm adopt mandatory bias audits, anonymous passenger protection protocols, and third-party reviews, or risk public exposure. Her message was simple. If you can't protect the dignity of every passenger, you don't deserve the public's trust. The pledge went viral. Celebrities endorsed it. Lawmakers began to draft legislation around it. And as her movement grew, Mrs. Eloise Harper returned to the same airport, the same terminal, holding her same lilac tote bag. This time, the airline crew stood and applauded her boarding, but she didn't need validation. Her daughter had already given her something far greater, power with purpose. But just as the world began to celebrate the victory, a new twist unraveled. An investigative journalist, digging deeper into Jetway's data records, found another troubling file. It was labeled Horizon Confidential. Inside were documents detailing a wider strategy, flagging not just families of high-profile investors, but community organizers, activists, minority SEALs, anyone seen as a risk to traditional structures. Amara's mother had been the test case, but she wasn't the only one. In fact, she wasn't even the first. The document was signed off by a shadow group tied to multiple companies across finance, tech, and logistics. And at the top of the Horizon Project report was a single chilling phrase: order maintained through selective disruption. A journalist contacted Amara and whispered a warning. You think you stopped Jetway, but Jetway was just a gate. So as the camera pans out on Amara Harper, standing tall with her mother beside her, we realized this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the start of something much bigger, because now she wasn't just fighting for one passenger. She was fighting for every person who had ever been told, "You don't belong." And next time, they won't see her coming. Subscribe now, because the conspiracy goes deeper than you think. Justice was a beginning. Now it's time for a reckoning.